Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have some questions. Has the pandemic radically shifted the relationship between employees and their companies? And what's the future of work? Let's get to the bottom line. It's hard to describe the panic that gripped the planet at this time 3 years ago. COVID-19 was still a mysterious virus. People were dying from it all around the world. No one knew how to deal with it other than staying 6 feet away from people, washing their hands frequently, and I guess just hoping for the best. Governments shut down their airports and schools and told people to stay isolated indoors. By the end of March 2020, the world's biggest companies were totally shut down, from Ford to Disney. As life picked back up, people started to have, quote, pandemic epiphanies. Was their job worth it? Would they rather care for their parents or their children? Would they rather do odd jobs or work from home? So what should we expect now, as more and more workers are being asked to head back to the office? Who has more bargaining power in the post-pandemic world, workers or their employers? And how are big corporations adapting to the new environment? Today, we're talking with Liz Hoffman, author of the just-released book, Crash Landing, the inside story of how the world's biggest companies survived an economy on the brink. For years, Liz covered markets and corporate deal-making at the Wall Street Journal, and now she's the business and finance editor at Semaphore, where, in full disclosure, I also work. And Julia Pollak, chief economist at the job search site ZipRecruiter.com, and Nick Bunker, economic research director for North America at the job search firm site Indeed.com. So we've got a lot of talent here to talk about some tough times. We're basically, 3 years still into COVID, but it changed society. And Liz, what are the biggest takeaways of how companies and how this nation found the way to adapt to this terrible pandemic?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve. It's good to see you. One, I think, just high-level takeaway that's important. It's a little backward-looking, though, which is the economy was just much more fragile than we had appreciated going into the pandemic. If you'll remember, in early 2020, you have unemployment at a 50-year low. You have the stock market setting record highs, and there was this veneer of strength and resilience that was just very quickly proven to be just that, pretty surface level. Looking ahead in terms of the lessons that I think and hope that companies take out of this, one is you never have as much cash as you think. I worry that lesson is actually not being learned and was not internalized, in part because the federal government stepped in, I think rightly, but and effectively bailed out the entire economy. But I think going forward, as we see sort of hiccups and sort of darker clouds gathering over the economy, I think companies are going to wish that they were a little more liquid than they have been so far.
A lot of the focus you have is, I really enjoyed reading about then Secretary of Treasury Steven Mnuchin in the middle of all this, some decisions he made. I'm just interested in who you think the heroes of that moment were and who the villains were.
I think Steven Mnuchin deserves a lot of credit here, he and Jay Powell, and both of them, by the way, kind of accidental bureaucrats, right? I think if you were making a list of who would be Treasury Secretary, before Donald Trump was elected, I don't think Steven Mnuchin would have been anywhere on it. He was a Hollywood producer, had been off Wall Street for years. Jay Powell, ended up at the Fed under the Obama administration as a compromise candidate, as a political compromise. So really, neither of them were supposed to be in those jobs. Those departments were incredibly understaffed, working largely remotely as almost everybody else was. I think deserve a lot of credit. Certainly some fair criticism. There's always a trade-off between getting money out quickly and getting it exactly where it needs to go. And I think that's part of the deal. I think the decision was made rightly here to just get it out. The Fed did and the Treasury did, in about 6 or 8 weeks, what it took them 9 months to do in 2008. What they never did in 1929, 1987, past crises. And so the lesson here is just send money out. Obviously, we're living now with the consequences of what I think was a spigot that was clearly open too wide for too long.
Well, thank you. Well, Julia Pollak, you're an economist, and you've seen the data that have come out at this time, and you also see what's going on today. How has this social contract around work changed?
Well, we saw the biggest reorganization to the way work is done in our lifetimes. Jobs that were predominantly done in person in offices were shifted to being remote. A huge share of workers ended up doing the majority of their work from home. And companies learned something from that experiment. The technology was there for decades before. We could have done this. There were many reasons why we didn't. There was a norm around being in the office, and in particular, hubs. For example, law firms where I am in Los Angeles, to have credibility, you need to be in Century City. Financial services companies felt that they needed to be on Wall Street to have credibility. Many of those norms were shattered with the pandemic because the experiment of remote work worked remarkably well. Companies found that they improved their recruitment and retention of workers, and in many cases they also saw productivity benefits, not across the board. In some companies there were productivity declines, but then again it's also hard to tease out exactly what caused those declines because the pandemic was so disruptive to childcare and many other parts of work. But for the most part, the experiment went better than expected, and remote work is now here to stay at a much higher level than it was before the pandemic. There are huge differences across the country. There are parts of the country where 30–40% of work days are remote, and others, like Mississippi, where only 5% of work is done remotely. So this is not a uniform change across the country, but in parts of the country, remote work has become dominant. Hybrid work across the country has become the dominant form of work for newly hired workers.
Well, I know that both you and Nick are in the human resources world, and you are in touch with companies. And, Nick, I'd just like to ask you, because I don't know how your businesses work actually. Are companies coming back today and saying, I want to recruit people who are going to be in the office, they're going to come in, no more of this remote stuff? Or do you guide and counsel them, Nick, and say, I'm sorry, the world has changed, and you're just going to have to deal with people who are going to work at home on Mondays and Fridays. I know it's going to feel like a, 4-day work, weekend to you, but that's just the way it is.
So one of the benefits of my job is that I'm not necessarily counseling these folks, but I can see the decisions they are making. So, for example, we can look at, say, what's happening to job postings on Indeed and some of the things that advertisers are describing those job postings. And what we can see in the latest data on, say, the share of job postings that advertise remote work is that they are still well above where they were prior to the pandemic. In 2019, in a strong, tight labor market, but obviously one that had not gone through the grand experiment of remote work in the spring of 2020, about 2 to 2.5% of postings advertise remote work. Now, here, last month in the U.S., it was closer to 8.5. Now, that's not as high as it was at periods in 2021 or 2022, but that's in part because there's been a pullback in hiring in lots of industries that tend to advertise remote work. So think of software development jobs in the tech sector, which has really pulled back of late. So I think what we're seeing in the data is that employers are still advertising remote work, in part because of something that Julia mentioned, is that this is really important to job seekers, and it helps with retention and getting hires into the company. We're still in a very tight labor market right now where job seekers have lots of advantages, and for the kinds of work that can be done remotely, lots of job seekers do consider that as a key attribute of the job. And if employers do want to hire, they probably need to consider their remote work strategy. So I might not advise all of our clients, but if I did, and they're looking to fill these sorts of jobs, remote work is definitely something they need to strongly look at.
Well, let me get Julia in on this too, because Julia, I was amused when Elon Musk, whom I think Liz Hoffman has interviewed before, but when he came out and said, look, if you're not going to come back to work, you're fired, kind of changed his tune. I mean, to come to Nick's point, out there, labor has some muscle at this moment, but what are you seeing in the marketplace?
So company after company that has announced a return to the office 5-day-a-week mandate has backtracked very quickly. We've seen many companies come out the gate saying that, and then within a week or two, they've said, well, how about 2 days a week, 3 days a week? The backlash is swift. About 60% of job seekers say that they are looking for remote work, that they'd ideally have remote jobs. We see on ZipRecruiter that job postings that are remote get about 50% more engagement. They're twice as likely to yield a high-quality candidate. And so the recruitment benefits are huge. There are also cost benefits. And I'm not talking about corporate real estate. That's relatively a relatively small line item on most companies' budgets, especially knowledge work industry companies. talking about labor costs, workers are prepared to take about an 8 to 10% wage cut. For parents of young children, that goes up to a 20% wage cut. Wow. For the opportunity to work remotely.
Wow. Well, Liz, let me ask you, and come back to your, riveting story and the experiences. The amount of money that was spent trying to prop everything up, and even not during the Trump administration, but also during the Biden administration, the American Recovery Act, and was greater than all the money that we spent in World War II. I mean, it's an enormous amount of money. Do you think we're back in a time where all that cash that came out has yet again still disguised some of the frailty and fragility and bad habits in the economy, or are we cleaned up now?
No, I absolutely do think that. Federal debt is, publicly held federal debt is more than 100% of GDP right now. And there are some people who think that is just completely unsustainable. There's an economic school of thought that says it's fine. I don't think we need to get into the minutia of that debate, but there is just so much money sloshing around, and really has been since 2008. I mean, you'll remember that the Fed and central banks around the world cut interest rates basically to zero coming out of 2008 to sort of to help the economy limp out of that crisis, to push banks to lend. The problem is that they could never wean the economy off it. You'll remember in the mid-2010s, 2014 and 2017, they tried to say, look, the punch bowl we're taking it away, the party is over. And the markets freaked out, and most central banks and frankly politicians didn't have the stomach to stick with that. Interestingly, coming out of this crisis, they don't have an option. Inflation is so stubborn and so bad that this has sort of perversely provided governments with the opportunity to do what they've wanted to do for a long time and been unable to, which is to kick the birds out of the nest, to say to investors, we are not here to save you. We do not care about your portfolio. And frankly, we are prepared to put these economies into recession to get a handle on this stuff. So look, just a ton of money floating around. I think looking back, almost certainly the last round of stimulus in the US was probably a mistake. That's a political decision, different from, things like were they too late to raise interest rates, which also, yes. But yeah, I think, when you're talking about the kind of bad habits that had been baked in, they have returned quickly. And the one that I think of is sort of this relentless push towards efficiency. There's kind of a great myth, which is a little bit true, but of technology, and as we get better technology, that you can squeeze every last inefficiency out of things. And so, for example, you are very nicely holding my book. I assume that you bought that on Amazon or something similar, and you got it within 24, maybe 48 hours. There's a cost to that. It is on one level incredibly great for consumers, but there is this rise of just-in-time efficiency, which is that you want as little inventory as possible. You don't want the nut arriving in the factory 1 second before it needs to be screwed into the bolt. When it works well, that leads to lower prices and better products, but it means there's no fat baked in. And that was really the problem as the pandemic really crusted over the global economy, and it's come right back. So people ask me a lot, have we learned any lessons? Sadly, I'm not sure that we have.
Well, before I go to Nick and Julia, because I want to talk to him about how, not just young people, but how people are thinking about work in the gig economy and scrambling to pay the bills, hold this stuff together, inflation. It's just, I could say this is going to be a lot of fun, folks, or it's going to be, a horrible, nightmarish future. But Liz, where did all the workers go? I was reading, I think from your book or somewhere, that 27 million people left the job market in 2021, or that many jobs regardless. But when you kind of look at it, and our very high openings, we've got very high inflation. The Fed is trying to kind of slow things down, but we have such a historically low unemployment rate right now that I'm just wondering where are all the people that we thought we used to have?
Part of this is that we don't know. There is like a real economic and academic mystery that is trying to be solved here. But a couple of places we do know, which is, at a human level, the pandemic forced people to kind of reassess what they want out of life, frankly. And many people decided that the jobs they had simply weren't worth it if they were willing to make some lifestyle changes. So that's number one. Number two is that things like childcare got very expensive and very problematic. And that, frankly, if you're a two-income household and the second parent is barely making more than it costs to send the kid to daycare, well, then you think, why am I doing this, right? So that's one. Another is that people delayed retirement in 2020. And so there's a little bit of catch up to be done there. The obvious answer is actually not true, which is corporate layoffs, right? We've seen a lot of big headlines, particularly out of Silicon Valley, but the numbers there just aren't enough to really make a dent. And you saw that we just got new job opening data out of the US, which showed that slightly down, but there's still something like 2.5 jobs per worker looking for them. And there's no end in sight to the sort of hourly wage war that we're seeing. So some very confusing and contradictory signals, I think, being sent in the labor market. The ones that get the headlines are, and I think rightly overdue, that Silicon Valley was a pretty fat and cushy place for a long time. And there's an efficiency that's being wrung out of that particular washcloth. But, as my co-panelists here noted, it's just incredibly tight labor market, epically tight. And the Fed is having, and central banks everywhere, governments are having an incredibly hard time cooling the economy because that labor engine just will not stop.
Well, Nick, the report that Liz was talking about is the JOLTS report, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. And it's showing that there is just, many more layoffs, job losses. There's a lot of churn out there. But what I'm interested in is how workers are approaching this right now. Are they saying my future is going to be, a lot of gig jobs here and there and patch them together and fit in the lifestyle I want? And so that kind of keeps them in the driver's seat of making choices? Or are they going to get shackled, maybe shackled's the wrong word, but, stuck and tethered to a single company for a long time? What is going on in the mind of the average worker you're seeing out there?
So I think we're still in a labor market where job seekers have lots of opportunities. There was a mention of how many job openings there are right now, and there's still, about 10.8 million job openings at the end of January, which is, up about 47% from where it was prior to the pandemic. So there's lots of opportunities out there right now. And I think, that means that there's a variety of options for workers so that, there can be, say, for folks who do want it, some of these, gig work or sort of independent contractor. But I think at the same time, this does give leverage and strengthen the bargaining position of workers at full-time jobs. So, there's been some allusions to the fact that there's a very low layoff rate right now, that workers aren't involuntarily losing their job at high rates right now. In fact, the latest data that we have is through the end of January, and the layoff rate was about 1.1%. That number, if you just went back, say, 2019, that would have been the all-time low in the series. So layoffs are quite low right now. What's not low is quitting, is the rate at which people are involuntarily leaving their jobs. And now that might sound bad on face value. Hey, all these people are quitting their jobs. But for the most part, when people are quitting their jobs, they're going to take new jobs. So this is really a sign of worker confidence. And I think that's part of the underlying strength we're seeing in the labor market right now. There's lots of demand for workers. People can switch their jobs. When you switch your job, you tend to get a pay raise. That's part of the reason why we have such strong pay gains right now. And I think to sort of loop this back to something we talked about earlier is that a lot of these really strong wage gains, a lot of these really strong demand for workers is in fact in the sectors that cannot be or really haven't been done remotely in the past. Bars and restaurants, retail positions, they really came roaring back from the initial shock of the pandemic, and they're still really powering forward the labor market recovery we're seeing right now.
Well, Julia, let me ask you a question. Could we shift, as Liz just said, this ruthless drive to more and more efficiency, to having, a problem of very, very few jobs available and very low unemployment, to a giant shift where all of a sudden automation, AI, many new technologies come in and make a massive structural change, and almost an earthquake, where the kinds of tightening we're talking about now is going to sound really anachronistic, and because we're going to see a very different shift around that social contract?
Well, business investment in research and development is high. It rose during the pandemic, and there are many firms that are trying to automate lots of different functions, from customer service. I imagine that you've probably spent hours frustrated on the phone trying to find a human to speak to rather than a chatbot, and in manufacturing and other industries as well. That said, historically during labor shortages, the biggest change actually has been an effort to recruit more workers, to find them and to bring them on board. We saw during World War II, for example, that the companies in the North started recruiting workers from the South. They started opening their doors to women, to African Americans, to people who'd previously been excluded from the labor force. And we're seeing that today as well. We've seen wage compression, we've seen job growth for women and for African Americans and for workers with disabilities exceed that for sort of other workers who were traditionally in a stronger position in the labor market. Another change that typically happens during labor shortages is a big push for immigration. In Europe, with its aging population and in sort of post-war labor shortages, there have been huge guest worker programs established. That does not seem to be on the political cards here, but that is something that would make a meaningful difference more quickly than most other policy proposals.
Let me just ask Liz finally, as you kind of looked at companies and how they adapted, if we were to be hit with another pandemic, if we were to hit with another massive storm of some kind that had global consequence, what do you think happens to the company? What happens to labor unions? What happens? Do we see? Can you see into the future at all? Into what happens the way we think about corporations, government, and workers today?
First of all, that's a bummer of a question, Steve. We just got out of one of those. I would say I think we're still reckoning with what do we want to take out of the pandemic and what do we want to leave in it from a corporate point of view, which is to say, as we've been talking about, there's a measure of flexibility and worker flexibility that I think will never totally go away. I don't fully understand the big fight and the hand-wringing that everyone seems to be having with their boss. Like, there's a certain amount of flexibility baked into working going forward. By the way, though, one thing I'll be fascinated to look at over the next 5 or 10 years is there's a huge correlation between advancement and face time. And so, what workers might want and think makes their life better and allows them to do their job more efficiently may actually end up being a bit of an ankle weight going forward. But I think a lot of that sort of changes to the day-to-day business of doing a job and managing a company is here to stay. I think one thing that I take a little comfort from, as I said earlier, just the speed with which the governments around the world reacted here. It's a slightly macabre way to think about it, but we are iterating in a positive direction and responding to crises. There is increasingly a better sense of what works and what doesn't. And I'm pretty heartened actually by the response, the government responses here. And again, you can have a lot of discussions and disagreements about moral hazard, but there's an interesting, I think, kind of intellectual exercise. If you'd had a pandemic that was half as bad as this one and required a response that was half as robust, you might have actually seen more disparate outcomes and gotten cleaner lessons and been able to engage more honestly in a debate about blame and fault and moral hazard. The truth is this was just so economically devastating. No company, no industry is able to function when revenue goes to zero. So I think this will be picked over by economists for a long time, but I think some of it's here to stay.
Journalist and author Liz Hoffman and economist Julia Pollak with ZipRecruiter.com and Nick Bunker with Indeed.com. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much.
So what's the bottom line? 3 years after the lockdowns, millions of people have died from COVID. Millions more lives have been shattered by the virus, and people are still getting sick with different mutations. The miracle here is that human beings all around the world have figured it out, how to go about their business, how to manage their families, how to connect with loved ones, how to buy stuff, shop, dream, travel, just generally bounce back. But the disruption to work is really permanent. Companies and governments are saying, come back to the office, and people are resisting. Most likely, some kind of compromise will be reached, where many jobs become hybrid, half in offices, and the other half, well, anywhere. There's no stopping the tech advances that have boomed in the pandemic era. But watch for days when we'll have an electronic version of ourselves that makes it look like we're at work while we're sipping coffee in our living rooms. And that's the bottom line.